The courtroom was tense, the kind of silence that presses down like a heavy weight. All eyes were on the young defendant standing at the table, his posture stiff with defiance. Dressed casually, he looked more like someone ready for a night out than a day facing the law. But it wasn't just his appearance that raised eyebrows, it was his attitude. Across from him sat Judge Marissa Carter, a woman who had spent years proving her mettle in a justice system where respect had to be earned, not demanded. Known for her fairness but also her firm resolve, she carried the air of someone who had seen it all. But this case was different. The defendant's arrogance wasn't just palpable, it was almost a performance, a calculated attempt to challenge the authority of the court itself. As Judge Carter began addressing the courtroom, her voice calm but commanding, the defendant interrupted. His words weren't just dismissive, they were cutting. "Shut up," he snapped, his tone laced with condescension that made the entire room freeze. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the court officers exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain of what might follow. For a moment, Judge Carter didn't respond. She simply stared at him, her dark eyes steady and unyielding. The tension thickened, and the defendant smirked, as if he thought he had won some invisible battle. But those who knew Judge Carter understood what was coming. Beneath her composed exterior, a storm was brewing, one that would make him wish he had thought twice before speaking. What happened next would not only redefine the defendant's understanding of authority, but also leave everyone in the courtroom stunned. Judge Carter wasn't about to let his insult slide. Instead, she delivered a response so swift, so sharp, that it echoed far beyond the walls of her courtroom. And as the reality of her words sank in, the arrogance in the young man's face faded, replaced by something he hadn't expected: regret. The defendant's smirk faded quickly as Judge Carter leaned forward, a steady gaze never leaving him. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of her silence, every second stretching into an eternity. Even those seated at the back of the courtroom could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't just a judge preparing to hand down a sentence. This was a woman who had been pushed to her limit. "You got some nerve," Judge Carter finally said, her voice low but razor-sharp. Her words cut through the defendant's bravado, but he tried to mask his unease with another scoff. It wasn't working. Everyone could see it. His confidence wasn't as bulletproof as he wanted it to appear. This wasn't the first time Judge Carter had faced someone like him. Over her years on the bench, she had dealt with countless defendants who believed they were above the law. Some had been hardened criminals with years of experience navigating the system. Others were like this young man, cocky, privileged, and convinced that their charm or arrogance could outmatch justice. But this one felt different. There was something almost deliberate about his defiance, as though he wanted to provoke her. The case itself had been relatively straightforward, or so it seemed at first glance. The young man, identified as Ethan Brooks, had been arrested for a series of reckless decisions that put others in danger. Witnesses described his behavior as careless and entitled, and the evidence against him was strong. Yet from the moment he entered the courtroom, it was clear he wasn't taking any of it seriously. He treated the proceedings like a minor inconvenience, rolling his eyes during testimony and openly laughing at the prosecution's arguments. Judge Carter had given him every chance to behave respectfully. She had warned him once, then twice, about his interruptions and dismissive comments. But Ethan either didn't understand or didn't care about the gravity of his situation. Perhaps he thought his charm, or his family's resources, would shield him from any real consequences. What Ethan didn't realize was that Judge Carter had seen men like him her entire life. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, she had learned early on how to spot arrogance disguised as confidence and entitlement masquerading as innocence. She had fought her way through law school, often underestimated because of her race, gender, and background. But those challenges had only made her stronger, and she carried those lessons with her into every case she presided over. As Judge Carter sat there, her gaze fixed on Ethan, she thought about the people who had been affected by his actions. One of them was sitting just a few feet away, a young woman whose life had been turned upside down because of Ethan's reckless choices. She clutched a small notebook in her hands, her knuckles white, as though holding onto it was the only thing keeping her steady. Her presence was a stark reminder of what was truly at stake, something Ethan seemed oblivious to. "You think this is a joke?" Judge Carter asked, breaking the silence again. Her tone was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Ethan shrugged, his smirk creeping back. "I think you're making it a bigger deal than it is," he said, his voice dripping with indifference. "People mess up all the time. It's not like anyone died." The room collectively held its breath. The audacity of his statement hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Judge Carter's jaw tightened, but she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to command attention. "That's where you're wrong," she said, her words deliberate. "Your actions might not have killed anyone, but they changed lives. They left scars that don't just fade away, and yet here you are, acting as though none of it matters, as though you're untouchable." Ethan's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair. "Look, I get it. You're mad because I didn't play by your rules, but you can't let your emotions cloud your judgment. Isn't that like the first rule of being a judge?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Even Ethan's lawyer, who had been silent for most of the proceedings, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was clear he was losing control of his client, and perhaps the case itself. But Judge Carter remained composed. She had dealt with far worse, and she wasn't about to let Ethan's arrogance derail the proceedings. Instead, she took a moment to gather her thoughts, her eyes scanning the room. She wanted everyone to understand that this case was about more than just one young man's behavior. It was about accountability, about ensuring that the law meant something, even to those who thought they were above it. "Let me explain something to you," Judge Carter said, her voice steady. "This isn't about me. It's not about my emotions or your opinion of me or even your opinion of this court. It's about justice. It's about the people whose lives were affected because you chose to ignore the rules that keep us all safe. And whether you like it or not, you're going to face the consequences of those choices." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Carter raised a hand, silencing him. "I've given you every opportunity to show some remorse, to take responsibility for your actions. But instead, you've chosen to double down on your arrogance. You've shown this court, and the people in it, nothing but disrespect." The room was silent again, the weight of her words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Ethan shifted in his seat, his confidence finally beginning to crack. He glanced toward his lawyer, but there was no rescue coming. He was alone, and for the first time it seemed to dawn on him just how serious the situation was. Judge Carter took a deep breath, her expression softening slightly as she looked toward the young woman clutching the notebook. "To those of you who were harmed by this defendant's actions, I want you to know that this court sees you. Your pain matters, your voices matter, and I will do everything in my power to ensure that justice is served." Ethan's smirk was gone now, replaced by a faint hint of unease. He fidgeted with his tie, his bravado slipping further with each passing second. For the first time, he looked less like a confident young man and more like someone who had finally realized the gravity of his situation. Judge Carter leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. She had made her point, but the sentencing was still to come. The tension in the room was palpable, a collective anticipation that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. What could happen next? Would Ethan finally acknowledge the weight of his actions, or would he continue down the path of defiance? And what would Judge Carter's final sentence reveal, not just about the case, but about the system she fought so hard to uphold? The answers would come soon enough, but for now, the courtroom was suspended in a moment of charged uncertainty, each person waiting to see how the story would unfold. Ethan's unease grew as the silence stretched, but he tried to mask it by adjusting his posture, leaning back with an air of indifference. Yet anyone paying close attention could see the subtle signs, his fingers tapping against the table, the slight downturn of his lips. He wasn't as sure of himself as he had been when he first walked into the courtroom. Judge Carter's words had left an impact, not just on Ethan, but on everyone in the room. The young woman clutching her notebook shifted in her seat, her eyes glistening as she glanced at Ethan. Her name was Rachel, and she had been one of the people directly affected by his reckless behavior. For weeks, she had been waiting for this moment, torn between the hope for justice and the fear that someone like Ethan would somehow evade accountability. Rachel had been driving home from her part-time job when Ethan's actions derailed her life. She still remembered the blaring horn, the screech of tires, and the terrifying realization that she couldn't stop in time. Her car had been totaled, her injuries severe enough to require weeks of recovery. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the emotional toll. She had lost her sense of security, her confidence on the road, and for a while, her hope that the system would see her as more than just another statistic. Ethan hadn't even bothered to check on her after the accident. Instead, he had laughed it off, claiming it was just one of those things, and that she was overreacting. His lack of remorse stung more than the crash itself. Rachel had kept that pain locked inside, but now sitting in this courtroom, she felt it bubbling to the surface. She wasn't the only one. Others in the gallery were also here because of Ethan. Neighbors whose property he had damaged, a store owner who had barely escaped injury. Each of them carried their own story, their own scars, and their own hope that Judge Carter would make things right. Ethan's lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, was an experienced defense attorney known for his sharp wit and ability to sway juries. But today, even he seemed at a loss. Ethan had ignored his advice repeatedly, and Caldwell could see the damage his client's arrogance was doing. He glanced at Ethan, leaning in to whisper something, but Ethan brushed him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. Judge Carter noticed the exchange but said nothing. Instead, she took a moment to address the courtroom, her gaze sweeping over the faces of those who had been harmed. "This is not just about one individual," she began, her voice steady but filled with quiet determination. "It's about the collective impact of his choices. The law exists to protect all of us, and when someone disregards it, they put more than just themselves at risk." Her words resonated deeply with Rachel, who felt a flicker of validation. For the first time, she believed someone in power truly understood what this was about. But as much as Judge Carter's words offered comfort, they also heightened the tension. What would the final outcome be? Would Ethan finally face consequences, or would his wealth and privilege shield him once again? Ethan's parents were seated near the back, their expressions a mix of concern and frustration. They had spared no expense in hiring Caldwell, hoping to mitigate the fallout from their son's behavior. But even they couldn't ignore the shift in the courtroom. This wasn't just about damage control anymore. It was about whether Ethan would learn a lesson that no amount of money could buy. Judge Carter's attention turned back to Ethan, who was now fidgeting with his watch. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her tone sharper than before. "Do you have anything to say for yourself? This is your chance to speak, not to interrupt, not to dismiss, but to genuinely explain your actions and the choices that brought you here." Ethan hesitated, caught off guard. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually take the opportunity seriously. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if weighing his options. The courtroom waited, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," he said, his voice quieter than before. "But honestly, I think everyone's blowing this out of proportion. Accidents happen. I'm not a bad person just because I made a mistake." His words hung in the air, and while they weren't as overtly dismissive as his earlier comments, they still carried an undercurrent of deflection. He wasn't taking full responsibility. He was minimizing the consequences of his actions, trying to paint himself as a victim of circumstance rather than someone who had made deliberate choices. Judge Carter's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a combination of disappointment and resolve. "A mistake," she repeated, her tone measured. "Is that truly how you see this? As an accident with no real consequences? Because I assure you the people in this room would describe it very differently." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his confidence eroding further under her scrutiny. Rachel clenched her notebook tighter, her heart pounding as she watched the scene unfold. She wanted to scream, to tell Ethan that his actions weren't just a mistake. They were a choice, one that had changed her life forever. But she stayed silent, trusting that Judge Carter would speak for all of them. The judge leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked on Ethan. "Let me ask you this," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "If the roles were reversed, if someone else's actions had put you in harm's way, caused you pain, and disrupted your life, would you still call it a mistake? Would you still be so quick to dismiss their responsibility?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. For the first time, he seemed genuinely at a loss for words. The courtroom was utterly silent, every person hanging on his reaction. His parents exchanged nervous glances, and even Caldwell seemed to be holding his breath. The young man's jaw tightened, and he looked away, avoiding Judge Carter's piercing gaze. "I don't know," he muttered finally, his voice barely audible. Judge Carter sat back, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps that's something you should think about," she said, "because understanding the impact of your actions is the first step toward accountability. And accountability is what this court demands, not just for the people you've harmed, but for the integrity of the law itself." The tension in the room reached a boiling point, and yet the conflict remained unresolved. What would Judge Carter's final decision be? Would Ethan truly grasp the weight of his actions, or would he continue to hide behind excuses and privilege? The answers were still to come, and the suspense was almost unbearable. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze darting between Judge Carter and the faces in the courtroom. The weight of her words pressed down on him, and for the first time, he seemed to grasp the seriousness of the moment. But even as his arrogance began to waver, there was still a flicker of defiance in his eyes, a refusal to fully concede. It wasn't clear whether he truly understood the damage he had caused, or if he was just trying to save face. Judge Carter remained silent for a moment, letting the tension build. The atmosphere in the room was electric, a collective anticipation crackling in the air. Rachel tightened her grip on the notebook, her knuckles white. She could feel her pulse racing, her emotions a storm of anger, frustration, and hope. She didn't just want Ethan to hear the words of the judge. She needed him to feel them, to carry their weight in the same way she carried the consequences of his actions. The silence was finally broken by the sound of Judge Carter clearing her throat. She leaned forward, folding her hands on the bench as her gaze bore into Ethan. "Mr. Brooks," she began, her tone low but firm, "you sit here today at a crossroads. On one side, there's accountability, an opportunity for you to take responsibility for your actions and understand their impact. On the other side is denial, a path where you continue to make excuses, to minimize, to deflect. The choice is yours, but let me be clear. The law will not allow you to walk away without consequence." Ethan's lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, took the opportunity to step in. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but urgent, "my client understands the gravity of the situation. Perhaps if we could—" Judge Carter held up her hand, silencing him. "Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate your advocacy, but this is not the time for excuses or negotiation. This is about justice, and I intend to see it through." Caldwell nodded and sank back into his chair, his face unreadable. Ethan, however, couldn't seem to keep still. He shifted in his seat again, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his tie. He opened his mouth as if to speak but hesitated, his usual bravado faltering under the intensity of the moment. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching like an eternity. Rachel glanced toward the others in the gallery, fellow victims of Ethan's recklessness. Their faces reflected her own emotions, a mix of hope, anger, and a desperate need for closure. They had all come here seeking the same thing, a sense of justice that would validate their pain and hold Ethan accountable. Judge Carter's voice broke through the silence again, sharp and steady. "Let me tell you a story, Mr. Brooks," she said, her tone taking on a more personal edge. "When I was young, I witnessed someone close to me suffer because of another person's thoughtless actions. The details don't matter, but what I learned from that experience has stayed with me my entire life. Choices have consequences, and those consequences don't just disappear because someone decides they're inconvenient. The people you've hurt deserve more than your indifference. They deserve your acknowledgement. They deserve justice." Her words hit the room like a thunderclap. Ethan visibly stiffened, and Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat. Judge Carter wasn't just addressing Ethan anymore. She was speaking to everyone, drawing on her own experiences to drive home the gravity of the situation. It was a rare glimpse into the humanity behind the robe, and it left the courtroom in stunned silence. Ethan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said, his tone lacking its usual confidence. I didn't realize it would get this bad." Judge Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. "Didn't think," she repeated, her voice cutting through his words. "Or didn't care, because there's a difference, Mr. Brooks, and the people in this room deserve to know which it is." Ethan opened his mouth to respond but faltered, his gaze dropping to the table. For the first time, he looked genuinely shaken, as though the weight of everything was finally beginning to sink in. The gallery watched him intently, their collective anticipation mounting. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment where he might finally face the truth of his actions. But Judge Carter wasn't done yet. She turned her attention to the gallery, addressing the victims directly. "To those of you who have been affected by this defendant's actions, I want you to know that your voices matter, your pain matters, and this court will not allow it to be dismissed or diminished. You came here seeking justice, and I intend to deliver it." Her words were met with a ripple of emotion throughout the room. Rachel felt tears sting her eyes as she clutched her notebook tighter. For the first time in months, she felt seen, heard, and validated. It wasn't just about punishing Ethan. It was about reclaiming a sense of dignity and fairness that had been stripped away by his actions. Ethan's parents exchanged worried glances, their earlier confidence now replaced by a growing sense of dread. They had assumed their son would receive a slap on the wrist, that his privilege and resources would shield him from the full weight of the law. But Judge Carter was making it clear that this would not be the case. The room was thick with tension as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Ethan sat frozen in his seat, his earlier arrogance now replaced by uncertainty. His lawyer leaned over to whisper something, but Ethan didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the table in front of him, his mind racing. Judge Carter leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable. The suspense was almost unbearable, the air in the courtroom charged with anticipation. Everyone knew they were on the brink of something significant, a moment that would determine not just the outcome of this case, but the lessons Ethan would carry forward. The stage was set, the tension at its peak. As Judge Carter prepared to deliver her final words, the room collectively held its breath, waiting to see how the story would unfold.